the truth is, I've never had a project in my life before where it became at one point as concerning to me as this project. And as you know, I mean, I've taken on the Freemasons. I went to Washington, D.C., went right into the house of the temple, met with leaders there that gave me 2 coins to keep me from getting killed by the Freemasons. So I've done a lot of this stuff in the past where, some people might have, been apprehensive to do it, but nothing until we started on this project had me a couple of different times looking over my shoulder wondering if we really should go down this road. And I know Chris felt that way a couple of times too, but we both believe that God has given us what I now believe to be the most important research in my life, certainly the most urgent message that I've ever personally delivered. And I say that as a man who's been in ministry over 30 years. I pastored for almost 25 years. I've held executive level positions in the largest evangelical organizations in the world. I've spoke at very large conferences and to very large radio and television audiences. And I'm telling everybody within the sound of my voice tonight and also who will listen to this recording later, nothing, nada, not one time during all that time did I work on a project or have a message as important as this latest investigation by myself and my co-author, the theologian and investigative bloodhound Chris Putnam. Anyway, bottom line, let's get to talking about this, because unless people have been buried under a rock around the world, people understand that we've entered 2012 aware now that something is going on at the Vatican. There is a power struggle, and it is boiling to the surface between factions over there inside the Roman Curia, the College of Cardinals. It involves the current Pope, Pope Benedict XVI. It involves his Secretary of State, Cardinal Tarcisio Bertoni. It involves other players that we can discuss during this show and that Chris and I have documented in this 600-page book, 6x9 binding, over 800 authoritative footnotes and images. And we titled it Petrus Romanus, the Final Pope is Here, because, as Chris said, we have, according to an ancient Catholic prophecy, which seems to be unfolding right on schedule, we have reached a moment when the final Pope, more commonly understood by both Catholic prophets and evangelicals as the false prophet of end times biblical fame that gives rise to the Antichrist, he's here. And if our investigation is correct, we could be within 60 days, 90 days, 120 days of the arrival of that assistant to the man of sin that was predicted thousands of years ago to arrive on this date.
Hey, Chris, let me ask you a question, and this is, Tom, great intro. The relevance of this to a lot of people who may not have an understanding of the Catholic Church or may not have an understanding of how this plays into the end time. What Tom has just said, obviously the false prophet, but there's a point that I think most people need to look behind the scenes, even the Catholic believers themselves, at just the, if you will, the arcane and Luciferic initiations of, for instance, what Malachi Martin wrote about and others wrote about, and a lot of people have been killed over. Could you kind of briefly and take as much time as you'd like, but share that about the actual enthronement of Lucifer? And if Tom, if you feel you can address it, whoever can address it, I think it's important for people to understand this, because when Jesus was tempted, the devil took him up and set him on, the top of the temple and basically said, look, all these kingdoms will be yours. And there's this misunderstanding in a lot of believers, whether they be Catholics or Protestants, just what really is going on and the throne of power, why it's so necessary, number one, for Lucifer to control the Catholic Church, and number two, to control Jerusalem. So let's go just to the Catholic Church first. Can you kind of encapsulate that for the listeners?
Sure, Steve. What you mentioned with the enthronement ceremony. Now, Malachi Martin wrote this book called Windswept House, and it's called a Vatican novel. But if you go and read the interviews or listen to the coast-to-coast interviews that Martin gave at the time that he wrote the book, he called it faction. In other words, it's fiction based on facts. And, he loosely, changed some names and a few things, but according to him, in interviews and the things that he said on Coast to Coast, that those things actually did happen. And one of the things that he claims happened was that there was a ritual that occurred simultaneously at the Vatican and in Charleston, South Carolina, where they enthroned Lucifer onto a throne symbolically, but the idea being that they were creating a future pope is what it sounded like. I mean, that's the contention that Martin makes, and there's some parts of the book that a lot of people aren't even aware of near the end that Tom and I uncovered. You'll see this quoted all over the internet, is what I'm getting at, about the enthronement ceremony, but most of them only quote the beginning of the book. Like the whole first chapter of the book goes into the details of it, but at the close of the book, Martin actually does a little recap of it and actually says the purpose of this ritual, which is really a really nasty kind of sex magic sort of thing that I don't even really want to describe in detail, but it involved pedophilia and other things in South Carolina. Now, I think the idea with this occult ceremony was that they were tied in over a phone line, and these guys acted this ritual out in South Carolina, while simultaneously this group called the Roman Phalanx was in the Vatican, and supposedly there's a magical connection that they have. Now, I don't really understand a lot about that kind of occultism, but I believe that they believe it, and there's something going on there. It's not the kind of area that I want to spend a lot of time researching because I just feel dirty when I do it. I'd rather dig into biblical studies and things like that. But
that's why he left all that nastiness to me.
Hey, Tom, yeah. Hey, Tom, I want you to address the nastiness because even in my book, Long Walker, one of the illustrations that was given to my sketch artist, who's a talented man, Brian Snowdy, in my opinion, probably one of the most gifted illustrators on the planet. The ritual that I was, and you guys need to understand this, is that the ritual that I was given to give to my sketch artist, and then it was given back to a high-ranking military general that happened to be at this horrid ceremony where there was child sacrifice and the Annunciation. This is, by the way, after the last Pope's death. During his funeral, on the underground Rome labyrinth, and some of the things that were present, including whether people can handle this or not, a live giant. I mean, this was given to me by an active duty general, and guess who was there? Caesar Chavez, and I'm sorry, not Caesar, Hugo. My apologies, I've got Caesar on my mind. Hugo Chavez was there, and he ran out of this ceremony, and when he went to the United Nations, the people, the world rulers, here's what people got to understand. When our Lord Jesus stated that the whole world lies in the evil one, that they were there, and the only man that saw for what it was Chavez. So the fascinating thing is, what we're talking about, the enthronement of Lucifer, we're talking about child sacrifice, we're talking about the raping of children, and then the slaying of children. It doesn't get any more disgusting. It is a blood sacrifice. It's just like the abortion issue. Abortion is a blood sacrifice to Lucifer. And there was and I think that people got to understand this. This isn't a quaint intellectualism. This is full-on slaughterism. There's a new word, Tom. Slaughterism, in which these people are invoking all the occult powers that they've been given through their ancestral bloodlines and fallen angels and everything else. And, I mean, when people just laugh and say, oh, that stuff's not real, this stuff is very real. So if you take what Chris said, Tom, and add whatever you want to add to it, it's critical that people understand this is not just a bunch of good old boys. These are people that have given their power unto the devil, and in welcoming him and enthroning him, they're ready to announce, guess what? Guess who controls the earth? And that's what is the most tragic, I would say, this mind-numbing thing that I know of, as we're being told in the Scripture. You guys, in this book are giving basically the key to the lock of understanding how the false prophet, the Antichrist, and all this stuff is going to play out, and most people just don't grasp the lateness of the hour. So, Tom, add to what Chris just said.
Well, I will do that. And in fact, there is so much that is going on right now, today, in the Vatican that is related to the overall conversation concerning what went on in the 1958 conclave, what went on in the 1963 conclave. Was Siri actually elected? Did he have to step aside, according to Malachi Martin, because of an international presence that came in? All of that is covered in this book, but what's beneath the surface of all of that is all of the principal players are back now. The principal players from the conclave of 1950 to 1963, the principal players of the year 2000 Fatima secret cover-up, when they released the so-called Secret of Fatima in June or July of the year 2000, if you look at who the principal players were then, they're the ones that are creating the shakeup in the Roman Curia right now. So as we have time tonight, if we get to a deeper, I think, conversation about what is happening, people will understand this whole enthronement of Lucifer, what happened in 58, what happened in 63, why Malachi Martin targeted 1961, because all the people, the game players then, are the ones now that are in the news, and most people don't know that because they have, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. There is a reason why, before we went on the air, Steve, that I was saying that people should not read our upcoming book, Petrus Romanus, The Final Pope is Here. They should not read it haphazardly. And I'm warning people right now that they should pray, even for faith, because we don't want people to be afraid. We're not in the fear business. But I have personally never dealt with a subject matter that as deep as this investigative research, or as troubling as this investigative research, or as timely as this investigative research, because we're seeing playing out right now in the year 2012, most likely, what has been undertaken from the 1950s and 1960s, and that Malachi Martin so bravely wrote about. And it's so what you have is you have a guy like myself who is both a publisher and an investigative researcher. On the other hand, you have Chris Putnam, who is an apologist and a theologian. In addition to that, I hired a private investigator. We contacted the Dane County Sheriff's Department to look into the murder of Father Coons with the question of, was he, Steve, part of what you were just talking about, was he actually was he a sacrificial victim? Was there something, we definitely know that there was an animal that was mutilated 24 hours exactly before he was killed in the same way. So we can get into all of that if you want. So to answer your question about Malachi Martin and what he said about the enthronement of Lucifer, and to remind people that it was in the 60s, mid-60s, when John Paul the Sixth granted Malachi Martin, who was a high-placed Jesuit priest inside the Vatican, he gave him a dispensation from his duties. Martin moved to New York, and he dedicated himself to writing about what was the term Chris used a moment ago, faction, writing fiction. But what he was really doing was he was telling the world what was going on, and he was trying to do it in a way that he wouldn't wind up getting killed, which some people believe he did anyway, as he was speaking out on issues stemming from the Second Vatican Council mostly, and other insider accounts of Catholic dogma and geopolitics. He was a member of the Vatican Advisory Council. He was a formidable polyglot. He could speak 17 languages. He was a personal secretary to renowned Jesuit Cardinal Augustine B. He had privileged information pertaining to secretive church and world issues, including the third secret of Fatima, which I want to tie some of this into tonight because it is more important than you might imagine just hearing me say those words, because Martin, if you remember, he spelled out parts of a plan to formally install the dreaded false prophet during a final conclave, but Martin indicated that the third secret of Fatima actually spoke of that final conclave in which Petrus Romanus, the false prophet of biblical fame would appear. And but behind what was going on in the Vatican, Martin believed that this old scheme that the Illuminati, the Alta Vendita, that the Illuminati would slowly invade the ranks of the Vatican hierarchy and literally turn it in basically to a propaganda tool for their own New Age and enlightened ideas. Well, Martin stated that, in fact, that had happened.